Could this be the end of an era in Pittsburgh? Will we see some significant unrestricted free agents changing teams this offseason, such as Kris Letang? Could he end up in Montreal? What's the future of Evgeny Malkin, Brian Rust? Will the Penguins look very different next year? Plus, we also want to talk about the future of Patrice Bergeron in Boston. He's also another significant pending unrestricted free agent. Where will defenseman Jacob Chychrun eventually be traded to? Could the future have him in Anaheim? We have some more milestones, some more interesting information from player safety, and unfortunately, we've lost another hockey legend this week. We'll discuss all that and more coming up next. Welcome back to another video here at Top Shelf Hockey. As I mentioned, we have a lot of NHL news and rumors to talk about today, and I certainly want to kick things off with talking about the passing of Guy Lafleur, the longtime NHL legendary player who had one heck of a long career. Certainly sad news here. This is the second NHL legend we've lost within the past week. Of course, Mike Bossy passed away not too long ago. Both these guys at a fairly young age. Guy Lafleur was 70 years old. Of course, played for a long time as a Montreal Canadian, won 5 Stanley Cups, multiple Hart trophies, multiple Art Ross trophies. I believe he had 3 Art Rosses, 2 Harts, a Conn Smythe trophy to his name. One of the greatest goal scorers, certainly of his generation, one of the greatest players of all time, putting up over 560 goals, 1,353 points in a really long career. Of course, he played mostly for Montreal, but did have a bit of a retirement and a comeback where he played 1 season with the Rangers and 2 years with the Quebec Nordiques. Now, I know a lot of the younger crowd or the people that might not have been, old enough to really remember a lot of Guy Lafleur's early career may not know why all that transpired. I know for myself, I mostly got to watch Guy Lafleur's latter stages of his career, given where I was at as a hockey fan in my young life at that point. Certainly missed the prime of his career, but once he made his comeback, I was old enough to kind of remember him playing in Quebec and New York. But I know, like, for example, in 84, 85, he ended up retiring, and a lot of that had to do with the fact that he wanted out of Montreal. Another star player ran into a major relationship issue with the coach, and certainly it's kind of an odd scenario, something you don't see very often, because at that point in the early 80s, Montreal ended up bringing in Jacques Lemaire to be the coach. Of course, Jacques Lemaire and Guy Lafleur were teammates and line mates. Lemaire was his centerman for quite some time, so they knew each other extremely well, or obviously had a good relationship. But when things transitioned to being coach and player instead of line mates, teammates, friends, it certainly changed. And we know Jacques Lemaire was known as being one of the best defensive coaches, you could say, very defense-first, defensive-minded, had a long coaching career as well as a playing career, and that just did not gel for the very offensively gifted and offensive-minded Lafleur. So after a stretch of time, he made it known that he wanted out of Montreal and wanted to trade, and they essentially refused to do that, given how that was going to, the optics with the fans and everything, having such a big name like one of the legendary players be traded. It's just something that he refused to do because they knew the backlash that would come for it. So he just said, well, fine, I'm just going to retire then. And then he took 3 years off, and after coming back, like I said, I believe he kind of started playing a little bit more, like some alumni exhibition games and stuff, and ended up getting noticed, and then the Rangers decided to bring him in on a contract 1 year, and then he ended up following his friend Michel Bergeron to the Nordiques because I believe he was with the Rangers and then took the coaching job in Quebec. I don't remember the full fine details of that, but essentially played a couple of years there, and those 3 years when he came back, he was still pretty darn good. Like, he certainly wasn't Guy Lafleur in his prime anymore, but he was putting up decent numbers. Like, his first year in Quebec, he played, I think it was like, he didn't play a full season, but like, he was close to a point per game for I think he had like 35 points in 37 or 38 games or something to that effect. Like, he was still really good. I just remember watching all the highlights of him streaking down the wing with the hair flopping in behind him, and just like the wicked shot, and just such a class act off the ice as well. Really known as being really good with the fans, really generous with the fans. I know a lot of people that have met him over the years, especially through different alumni and Legends games. You see the Habs Legends doing tours all the time. He did a lot of participation that way. He was always really good with the people, and like I said, he's one of the greatest to ever do it, and another big time hockey legend. has his life come to an end here. It's been a tough time in hockey lately, so hopefully we don't have any more legends succumb to anything like this and anytime soon. But it certainly had his battles with lung cancer. We know that. And, just want to offer my condolences to those that were close to him. And obviously, one of the greatest to ever do it. Now, as I mentioned as well, we have some other news to look at. We had on some more happy news. We had some more milestones last night. We had the Steven Stamkos passing of Marty St. Louis to pass and take the all-time point leader in franchise history. Of course, we talked about the day before where he had tied the record and he got another point last night to take the record all on his own. So Stamkos is now the all-time leader in franchise history for points, which is not a huge surprise. He's a terrific player ever since going first overall. Certainly evolved his game over the years. At one point, he was very much a sniper, scoring 60 goals. Certainly plays a little bit of a different style game now, but certainly still capable of putting up big point totals, and the Lightning are going to be a handful in the playoffs here yet again for the third year in a row after being back-to-back champions. They proved that last night with an 8-1 thumping of the Toronto Maple Leafs, and that was without Braden Point being in their lineup. I know the Leafs were out without Matthews, but still, the fact that you could understand the Leafs maybe struggling a little bit without their best player. Not that that's really an excuse to lose that badly, but on the Tampa side of things, they still put up 8 goals without Braden Point, which is extremely impressive. So we'll see. Those two are likely going to have a good shot here at meeting in the first round of the playoffs and be the first playoff series in their history. So it'll be very interesting to watch that. Also had a milestone set in the Rangers organization with Artemi Panarin taking the record for most assists in a season by a forward. So he's certainly been putting up big numbers. The Rangers have had an incredible season and are well prepared for their playoffs as well, which is likely going to be against the Penguins, but not a guarantee. That's not set in stone here as of yet. Now, as I mentioned, we also had a few fines handed out by NHL Player Safety. Nothing too serious, but the Lightning Leaf game I was just referring to certainly had its moments last night. It certainly had, some fisticuffs going on. Maroon and Simmons were at each other numerous times, but a lot of it was verbal. They eventually did have a bit of a scrum, but nothing too serious. But Kyle Clifford of the Leafs was fined for high sticking. At one point during a scrum, Corey Perry was up against the boards and had his helmet off and kind of come down on his head with a stick. Like, it wasn't hard, but still looked like he did it intentionally. And even if he didn't do it hard, it still would hurt. Those sticks don't feel good on the head at any point. And Wayne Simmons was also fined last night for charging also. So certainly nothing real major got out of control, but certainly the intensity's turned up a fair bit, and which could be a playoff series here in the very near future. Speaking of playoffs, we did get our first series confirmed for round 1. The St. Louis Blues will, in fact, meet the Minnesota Wild. With where they're at in standings, there's no chance of that changing now. So we know the Avalanche are going to be first. St. Louis and Minnesota will be 2-3 in the Central Division, so they will 100% be playing each other. As much as they both had really strong seasons, the Blues have dominated the Wild, but outside of that, the Wild have had such a phenomenal year. Hard to imagine, but it could be a very interesting playoff series for sure. A couple quick signings as well. The Hawks have signed one of their interesting D prospects, Ethan Del Maestro, who is a 2021 fifth-round pick, a defenseman from OHL Mississauga. I know the Hawks have been very pleasantly surprised with his development this year, and we're eager to get him under contract. And then the Kraken have signed another D prospect as well, Riker Evans, who was their second pick after Matty Beniers in the 2021 NHL draft. And the Regina Pats organization, the Western Hockey League, he's had a phenomenal year, putting up some great offensive numbers, scoring 14 goals and 47 points. So he's on pace as well to have a real solid year. So nice to see those two contracts in place. Now, as I mentioned, we have some trade and rumors around free agency and some movement we could see. Obviously, some of this information comes from, actually the bulk of it, from an Athletic article by Josh Shea, the Penguins beat writer, who's basically was a mailbag type article, but asked a lot of questions from fans. And one of the questions was the future of some of their big name free agents like Letang, Malkin, and Brian Rust predominantly were the main three. Of course, they're by far the most significant players that need new contracts in an organization next year. You can throw Rickard Rakell in there, but of course he's not a long-time Penguin, so the future there is not quite so interesting, you could say. But Malkin and Letang, especially, who've been long-time Penguins. Russ has been there a fair bit of time now too, and certainly played big roles in their success. So what the future holds for all of them will be extremely interesting. It's going to be proving very difficult for Pittsburgh to keep all of them, given the fact that Rust is certainly in line for a significant raise. In the case of Malkin, who's obviously making over $9 million, What contract is he going to be looking at for next year or beyond? We don't really know. Malkin can still play at a very high level. Obviously had issues staying healthy, whereas Kris Letang has been a lot more durable in recent years. He did have some major, injury and illness issues in the past. He did miss significant time before, but lately it hasn't been as bad as it was at one point. So certainly you have to think he's playing at a high level too. Kris Letang's probably going to be able to command more money than what he's making right now, which I believe is at $7.5 million. So, or is it $7.25 million? So he's likely in line for at least the same, if not more, money based on the market. At least, some of these players might decide to take less money if they really want to stay put and stay in the same organization. That's time will tell on that. In the case of Evgeny Malkin, I don't know what he's going to command. Is he more concerned about money? Does he just want to stay in Pittsburgh and have a chance to win? Time will tell. But in this article, Josh Yeo was, kind of, asked what his opinion is. Of course, he's got, some intel, obviously well connected to the team. And he said basically if he had to make a prediction, he would predict out of the three, the one that's the most likely to stay is Evgeny Malkin. He sees him most likely going to sign another contract and finish his career in Pittsburgh. And keep in mind as well, which he does mention in the article, which makes a lot of sense and I agree with, is keeping captain Sidney Crosby happy is also important as well. Not only are these guys, good friends of his that he's played with for a long time, but he knows that they're capable of helping him win. And we know how competitive and driven Crosby is, that right up until the day until he retires, he's going to be wanting nothing short of a Stanley Cup or he won't be happy. That's just how the guy's wired. He's one of the more competitive people you're ever going to meet in that regard. So certainly you're going to have to think that he's going to be looking at things not only from a personal standpoint, but also from a on-ice product and what he feels they need to win. And will he be pleased if any of these guys leave? I don't know, but it's all more to do with economics than anything else. They just going to be pretty much impossible to keep them all. But he also makes predictions that Kris Letang goes to Montreal and Bryan Rust goes to Detroit. Now, of course, that's just his best guess, but there's been a lot of talk since the day that Kent Hughes was hired as the Habs GM that some of his former clients now, longtime clients that he had longtime relationships with, like Kris Letang and Patrice Bergeron, who we'll talk about here as well, could they head to Montreal because of that connection? Would he be interested in bringing them in? Clearly, they're going to be going through a bit of a rebuild, but we don't really know the full extent of this rebuild in Montreal yet. We saw them make some moves ahead of the deadline, and it's clear that they're going to not bring back the same roster. We know that, that's a given. But how much of a rebuild is this going to be? We really don't know the full extent of that. And to be honest, what we saw Jeff Gorton do in the Rangers organization, that rebuild was accelerated by dipping into free agency. And if he thinks that they have enough pieces there with what they have, some young players now like Suzuki and Caulfield, for example, I know they're quite fond of Jake Evans. Ryan Poehling's played a lot more this year. Like if they see those guys as being there for a long term, then of course they have Josh Anderson on a long-term contract. They could potentially, continue to move out a few other veteran forwards to kind of shake things up. We know Jeff Petrie could likely move. We know the goaltending situation is up in the air, but that's a big question mark and discussion that we've talked about a lot extensively in other videos. But could they realistically, dip into free agency with a player or two, ship out a bunch of other players to make the room and kind of come back with a whole new roster, but not really go full rebuild? Like, it is possible that they could go down that road. Like I said before, like you take away Jonathan Drouin, let's say he can be moved. You take maybe Mike Hoffman and maybe, Jeff Petrie. Suddenly, that's a lot of money off the books, right? So then you have some flexibility. So, could they dip into the free agency and sign a guy like Letang? Well, that's a real possibility, especially if they can move Petrie and bring in Letang. Then they still have a big-time right-shot defenseman who can power play, be a power play quarterback and give you lots of offense from the back end, be a good mentor for some of those other young D. It makes sense that they could pull that off. I don't know that that's the road they're going to go, but that's the prediction here in this article, and I have to say that I don't entirely disagree with it. I could see it. Out of the three, obviously, Letang going to Montreal does make some sense. Now, in terms of Bryan Rust, I think going to Detroit could be a possibility. There's obviously a team that's going to have money to spend. I believe that's his home state of Michigan, so it certainly would be like a homecoming. Very much, interesting and appealing in that regard for some players. He's already had a chance to do some winning when it comes to Stanley Cup, so he may not be thinking about that as much as, maybe a little bit later in my career now, have a chance to cash in, play closer to home. Those types of things might be more important. We don't know. And we know that Detroit very well is another team that starting to come out of this rebuild, but this rebuild could drag on a little bit further. Kind of depends on its offseason, how it goes. Brian Rust could be a big part to them, taking a step forward, right? So time will tell. Very interesting. When it comes to Bergeron, there's been no talks at all contract-wise, and it's kind of done that by design. The Bruins and his, new agent who would taken over the contract from Kent Hughes at the agency he's with, has not had any talks, and they won't be until after the season. Nobody really knows what Bergeron's future is. If he's going to keep playing, does he prefer to stay in Boston? Does he think he wants to change? Nobody has a clue. It'd be weird to see him in another uniform, and I wouldn't be shocked at all if he does want to keep playing and he signs a short-term deal to stay in Boston, but that's up in the air. Now, when it comes back to Letang for a sec, though, there have been talks that there are some contract talks on his regard with the Penguins, but it's been not a lot, nothing extensive. Nothing really overly formal, but there has been word that they've had some, preliminary discussions, probably just kind of get some feelers out there to get an idea where each side is at, but that's it. So it's very early and really doesn't give you an indication which way it's going to go on either direction. So what do you think of those free agents? Does it make sense that Letang could end up in Montreal, Russ could end up in Pittsburgh? Now, of course, if all this happens, that would give some flexibility to the Penguins cap-wise. They might want to find another defenseman that could possibly replace Letang. I think a lot of people feel right now that guys like Dumoulin and Marino, for example, are not exactly number 1D. They'd be better suited being 2, 3, 4. So they still would need a top D-man, and that would really set them back, I would think, when it comes to their offense and their power play. That they'd have to go on the market if Letang leaves and try to find somebody else to replace him. I know John Klingberg's a name that came up in the article, but I'm not sure that makes a lot of sense, because to me that'd probably be better off to sign Letang if he's willing to stay, and it really boils down to him going to Montreal strictly because it's more about money and everything like that. Like if he says, well, I can make more money there. I'm not so worried about winning. I'm going to go home, that type of thing. Then it might be hard to compete with. But if it really boils down to, I'd like to stay in Pittsburgh if you're willing to pay me, then it would make more sense to pay Letang than it would be to bring in Klingberg. Stick with what you know and what works and what clicks with the other guys. And I'm not sure that Klingberg's going to come any cheaper. So from a cap perspective, I get the replacement and the comparable, but I'm not sure it makes a lot of sense. So I don't know about that. When it comes to the trades, though, that we could see, Jacob Chychrun's a name that's been big time talked about before the deadline. Never happened. Likely going to happen in the offseason. I did see some information today that suggested the Anaheim Ducks are certainly likely very much interested. They were one of the teams rumored before. And of course, after trading, Lindholm and Manson, etc., they're going to be wanting to add, ideally a veteran. And even though he's not really an older veteran, he's kind of like a young established defenseman with some term on his contract, which kind of fits the bill for what they want, being the fact they're going to be a much younger team next year. Going to be, very much going through a rebuild here, and he could be a big piece of that. But one thing that the Ducks would have to be willing to give up if they're even going to entertain discussions on Chychrun would be to include one of their top D prospects, Zellweger. I mean, he's certainly, having a really solid offensive season. 18, soon to be 19 years old. Going to be a big ask on the Coyotes, and that wouldn't be the only piece. They're probably looking at a first-round pick plus him and probably another piece too, right? So I don't know what else the Anaheim Ducks would be willing to include, but they do have lots of other prospects. They'd probably throw in Maxime Comtois. I don't know how much interest the Coyotes would have in him, but I know he's certainly a player that they probably wouldn't mind getting a fresh start for, and he's still young and has a lot of upside. A fresh start somewhere might be good for him. So you throw in Comtois, who's a former, fairly highly drafted player, Zellweger at first, and I'm not sure if they'd want anything more than that, maybe a second or something like that. It could get the deal done. The Anaheim Ducks could certainly pull it off without taking away too much from their future, but at the same time, their pick this year in the draft is going to be fairly high. Depending on how they feel about it, they may not want to do that. And next year's pick, the 23 draft, is going to be much deeper and way more talented than this year, so I would be reluctant if I were them to move that pick. So time will tell, but it'll be interesting to see where Chychrun ends up, but I could see the Ducks being a remote possibility for sure. That is all your news for today. Let me know your thoughts, everything discussed in the comment section down below, and we can talk about it further. If you're new to this channel, make sure you subscribe and stick around. We'll keep you up to date with all the latest news, rumors, and analysis on all 32 NHL teams. Thank you for watching, and I will catch you next time.